If you have a fatigue that's not relieved by rest, where you're waking up in the morning and your energy is not what it used to be, or you're crashing and you're relying more on caffeine, your body is screaming at you to do something about it.
Welcome to the Mastering Mindfulness Institute. Here, we explore how food can become your greatest teacher and your body can become your wisest guide. I'm your host, Gina Warfel, helping you build a deeper connection with your food and body. Let's begin our journey together. Hey, welcome back to the Mastering Mindfulness podcast. Today's episode is for you if you're struggling with fatigue or your energy. Our energy is one of the most powerful ways that our body communicates to us when there's something that's off, and it has such a huge impact on our lives. If you have good energy, you feel like you can move through your day with optimism and you want to take care of your body. And when you feel exhausted, your whole life just absolutely stops. And so I think energy is one of the strongest ways our bodies communicate to us and also has one of the biggest impacts on our lives. And so today I brought in the energy expert to really help us understand what fatigue and energy struggles could really be telling us. I have Dr. Evan Hirsch, and he is a world-renowned chronic fatigue expert. He's the creator of the Energy MD method, and this is a science-backed, clinically proven four-step process to help resolve chronic fatigue and related symptoms from long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome. So, Dr. Evan, thank you so much for being here.
Gina, thanks so much for having me on, and you can call me Evan.
A lot of my listeners are on their health journey and they're getting to know their bodies a little bit better. And so I know that this topic will be so relatable as we're trying to understand the ways that our body communicates to us with shifting energy. And so not only are a lot of my listeners really interested in this topic, but I'm so curious to have this conversation with you today because I'm the kind of person that I've always had really good energy up until about this last year. I've been hitting that 3 to 5 p.m. kind of exhaustion and crash. And it brought up a very interesting question that I haven't had to answer before, which is this low energy or this feeling of being wiped out, is this a normal thing that we have because we have too much stress, we have too much pressure in our days? Or is this a clue from our bodies? I need to go deeper and I need to explore. Like, would you say that any amount of low energy is something that's normal? Or how do you differentiate between that and a deeper exploration of some of the things we might talk about today?
Yeah, so there's acute fatigue, which comes from, burn the candles, staying up late, going to a concert. You come home, the next day you're kind of wiped out, but then you recover. The chronic fatigue is really when you're having day-to-day tiredness that's not relieved by rest. Okay, that's essentially the definition. And so if you're finding that you're crashing, you're needing naps, you're needing caffeine, all of those are signs that something is going on, whether it's mental, emotional stress or physical stressors, like some of those that we're going to talk about today, that need to be remedied. But regardless, it's an opportunity to pay attention and to see what is going on actually in reality and what potentially needs to change.
And so could that be for any length of time? Like when I hear the word chronic fatigue, I think of someone who is constantly exhausted all day long from morning to night. Is that correct? Or could that be in when they just first wake up or in the afternoon? Or
Yeah,
how would you give
there's
that up?
yeah, it's a whole gamut. And so there can be just, you're functioning okay, but you're crashing and you need to consume caffeine or take a nap in order to be able to get through your day. Can't really do anything in the evenings or the weekends because you're tired and you kind of need to recover. All the way to chronic fatigue syndrome, which is 6 months of having really awful exhaustion, post-exertional malaise, where you exert yourself and you feel worse, brain fog, body pain, sleep issues for
Hmm.
6 months. So that's kind of like diagnosable chronic fatigue syndrome. But that doesn't mean, if you're finding the need to nap every day or your energy is crashing, that you don't need to look at it.
Mm. Well, I'm really excited to pick apart the differences between chronic fatigue and ask you more about this. But first, I'm kind of curious because helping people with their energy is so specific. I've actually never seen another doctor just so hone in on this one thing. Where did this inspiration come from?
So I had a couple of influences. First off, and I didn't realize that this was happening, but when I was in high school, my older sister ended up getting chronic fatigue, and so she was struggling with it, and I didn't realize it until years later that that's what she had. And then when I started my residency program out here in Washington State, I met my wife, we fell in love, and 3 months later, she couldn't get out of bed for the better part of 3 years. And so I felt really disempowered. I was trying to help her. I was talking to my colleagues and my attendings, my mentors, and nobody really had much to offer besides, okay, is it a thyroid issue? Is she having like cardiovascular issues, lung issues, et cetera, like more severe things? There really wasn't anything that was kind of like the middle ground. And so she got mostly better after a number of years. And then a couple years after that, I got chronic fatigue, and it lasted for 5 years and just about destroyed my life, my relationships. She was coming, we had a newborn child. Stacy, my
Wow.
wife, was coming out of her chronic fatigue. And she's like, hey, can you help out with the dishes? And I would like come home from work and I would just lie on my couch. My daughter would say, hey, can you play with me? And I couldn't. It just broke my heart. And so it was a really challenging time, really hard on our relationship. I had to keep hiring people to do the work that I was supposed to be doing in my business, whether it was a practitioner or a practice manager. And I had 4,000 square feet of office space and 10 employees, and I was really struggling. And so I finally, after napping underneath my desk, full of shame, with my door locked so that nobody could see, for what felt like the thousandth day in a row, I realized that, okay, I was already practicing functional medicine at that time. I came out of residency and started practicing functional medicine. And I was board certified in holistic medicine while I was going through residency. And I was trained in acupuncture and all these other things. And so I had really great tools, and I was like, okay, I have to use these tools. I have to apply them to myself. And so I started doing that, but I got stuck. I got stuck in integrative and functional medicine. I was replacing my deficiencies, my hormones, my mitochondria, my vitamins, my minerals, my lifestyle habits. All of that was spot on, really good, and I still wasn't better. And so I had to go into environmental medicine. I kind of went on this journey of like, what are all the potential causes of what I have? And how do I remedy them? And so I went into heavy metals and chemicals and molds and infections, including Lyme disease and Epstein-Barr and now COVID, and then into nervous system dysfunction. And as I went into each one of these things and I found out I had it and I had all these causes and I started to remove them, I got a little bit better every step along the way until I got the health, the great health that I have today. So that was my journey, and then I wrote a book about it, and that really became my mission where I was like, I don't want anybody to struggle the way that my family and I have. And so that
Wow.
became the hill that I was going to die on.
Wow. So would you say that chronic fatigue syndrome is, I guess, almost similar to, I don't want to say IBS because IBS seems very like unknown, but is it kind of a blanket term for you have fatigue and it could be related to many different things that you have to explore rather than a
Yes.
diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the diagnosis really doesn't give you much, at least from a conventional standpoint. I think the greatest gift that it gives people is a label which they can then search for as long as they don't apply that label to themselves too much, right? And they remember that they are going to get healthy and they're going to get well, and they don't read the myths online around you can't get better. Because we have over 100 testimonials on our website to people who have gotten better from this process. And what I learned is that everybody who has chronic fatigue, whether it's chronic fatigue syndrome or long COVID or just really bad chronic fatigue, that they all have what I call the toxic five. This combination of the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections, and the nervous system dysfunction. And they have all of it. And all of it has to be remedied in order for people to get better. And that's the main issue that I see when people come to see me is that they're missing something or multiple things. They're seeing practitioners who are doing a bunch of testing. And if the test doesn't come back as abnormal, and we can get into the reasons why testing is highly imperfect, but if the test doesn't come back as abnormal, then they're not treating that particular cause. And then people aren't getting all the way better.
That makes so much sense. I definitely want to unpack that more of like testing and what are those things that people should be looking at. But you mentioned something about long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome. Are they similar? How are they different? Or is long COVID just one of the chronic fatigue syndrome categories? How do those fit together?
Yeah, so long COVID essentially is chronic fatigue syndrome, except with a new player in the game, which is COVID or the spike protein.
Mm.
But the reality is that, the reason why 35% of everybody who gets COVID these days ends up with persistent symptoms, whether it's loss of smell and taste, or a lot of these that we see in chronic fatigue syndrome, like the body pain and the brain fog and the sleep issues. The reason why would they get those is because they have the toxic five already in their body. And the reality is that they just didn't know it wasn't really a big deal, but the spike protein or COVID becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back, and then all of a sudden they get these symptoms. But it comes from the virus getting into the body and bypassing the immune system, and the immune system is distracted by the toxic five. So it's not functioning correctly. COVID can come in and it can take hold and it can cause over 250 different symptoms depending on where in the body it decides to habitate.
Wow, that's so interesting. So if I heard you right, if we have COVID, we all have these spike proteins. Maybe you could even explain that a little bit too for people who haven't heard of that word of spike proteins and how that influences our body. And from what I heard you say is that when we get COVID, we get these spike proteins, but the difference between someone feeling it versus the symptoms of long COVID versus someone who doesn't is that they have this toxic burden, one of those five, and it or one or many of the five, and it's kind of putting them over the edge. The immune system is like overburdened. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, so the spike protein is this protein, every virus has a protein that it injects into the cells that it infects. And so the spike protein is just we've been talking about it so much the last couple of years that it's commonly known. But the virus attaches onto the cell that injects the spike protein into the cell, and then excuse me, takes over the machinery of the cell. So whether it's the nucleus or whether it's the DNA that's in the mitochondria, it's then taking over the production. And so consequently, a lot of what we're seeing is some of the younger people who are exercising, they go back to exercise too soon and they think they're all better, and then they go back to working out or running or whatever, boom, and then they end up getting long COVID and their energy is kaput. And that really comes from the fact that our mitochondria, which is a part of our cells found in every cell in the body except for red blood cells, that produces 70 to 90% of our energy. And when the spike protein comes in and it starts using the DNA in the mitochondria to replicate itself, when you ask the mitochondria to produce more energy because you're going to go for a run or you're going to go work out, what it does is it just shoots the production of the spike protein through the roof, and you end up getting flooded with the spike protein, which ends up damaging the mitochondria, increasing stress, decreasing your hormones, and causing a bunch of the symptoms that people are experiencing.
Wow. So exercise truly is worse if you're recovering from that.
Absolutely. You really have to wait if you have, and I tell people, right now, if you get a virus, it's not just that you are okay to exercise when you no longer have symptoms. I tell people you really need to wait a couple more weeks after that before you go back, and you need to be really gentle because that really seems to be one of the major triggers that we see.
Wow. And is that true of all viruses or people who are recovering from chronic infections like Lyme and Epstein-Barr that take a long time to heal? Should they also not be putting that burden on their body?
Yes, but it's not as bad. So generally, previously with viruses, once you have recovered, you had a bad flu or whatever, and then maybe it takes a week or so, but then you're back to baseline and you see how it feels and you start to exercise and then you're okay. You don't have this backslide that we're
Mm.
seeing with the COVID.
That is so interesting. So, how would somebody know if they have chronic fatigue or related to long COVID? What are like some of the differences and the similarities, and how is that diagnosed?
So with long COVID, you really need to have your symptoms for about 2 months right now. That's currently kind of like what the diagnostic criteria. And
Mm.
it's symptoms that persist after a viral illness. Now, that can be directly after. So let's say you've lost in taste and smell, you've got some body pain, you've got some fatigue, you've got some brain fog. It can just be one of those symptoms. You have the virus, you get over the virus, but you're still having these persistent symptoms, and they persist for longer than 2 months. For other people, those symptoms will go away. Like you'll feel fine, and then 2 to 4 to 6 months later, all of a sudden you get really weird symptoms. You've got heart palpitations, you've got diarrhea, you don't know why, and there's no really triggering event that you can think of. And then those symptoms last for a couple of months. And so I tell people it's really any weird symptoms that has come on since 2020 that potentially you had a viral illness either just previous or maybe a couple months prior. Most people kind of have this understanding at this point. People are like documenting when they have COVID and the number of times they have COVID. And so they generally will come in and say, you know what, I've been sick since. And I'll say, did you have COVID around the time? And they say yes, or they got a vaccination around that time, or whatever it is. People have a little bit more awareness around what their trigger potentially is. And so that's kind of diagnostic criteria for COVID. And it really varies in terms of the symptoms that people have. Like you can have just the loss of taste and smell. You can have the really bad fatigue that puts you in bed for a number of months. And then with the chronic fatigue syndrome, it's a lot of the same symptoms. I mean, it's a little bit more specific in terms of the diagnosis. It's 6 months. You have to have these different symptoms. You have to have the chronic fatigue, exhaustion with the post-exertional malaise, where when you exert yourself, you feel worse, with the brain fog, with the sleep issues, with the body pain. So it's a little bit more specific. But for me, I didn't have the sleep issues. I had everything else when I had my chronic fatigue syndrome, but I was down and out. Like just because I don't qualify for a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome doesn't mean that I don't need help, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that that was so hard because I had COVID and for, probably a week or 2 weeks after it was done, I mean, I felt completely exhausted and couldn't get out of bed, couldn't think properly. And I just can't imagine what that feels like for someone who's dealing with that feeling for an extended period of time and
All
how
the
hard
time.
that is. Yeah. So when you talked about some of the pitfalls to lab testing and missing certain things to help understand like what is the source and the origin, and I would imagine that it's probably pretty helpful to understand when you're figuring out what do I need to do from a treatment perspective. What are some of those pitfalls with diagnoses or lab testing, and what are the things people should be considering?
So when I got into the world well, actually, I think it was even in medical school when I learned test, don't guess, which unfortunately hasn't really proved to be helpful later in my career. So for the last decade, I've been testing people for their heavy metals and their chemicals and their molds and their infections every 3 months or so. And I finally stopped testing last year.
Hmm.
And the reason why is because what I found over the course of, 9, 12, 18 months that I was working with people is that all of those toxins came out when people had chronic fatigue. All the heavy metals, all the chemicals, all the molds, all the infections ended up coming out. And what I realized is that the best way that I could serve people is to treat all of these different causes to make sure that there was no stone left unturned. Because everybody who I saw, whether they were coming to see me or I was doing the testing, they would have negative tests. So they would have tests that would indicate that they didn't have heavy metals or chemicals or molds or infections. And so then we wouldn't treat that. But then let's say that we did that test at 3 months. But then we do the test again at 9 months, and then all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of heavy metals. And what I learned is that those tests, especially the urinary tests, the urine tests, are really tests that indicate your ability to excrete, your ability to get these toxins out of your body. They're not telling you what your total body burden is. And the more toxins and infections you have in the body, the more these pathways are clogged. And so you're not going to be able to find a positive test. And so then if you don't find it, you're not going to treat it. And so every single person pretty much who I see who comes into my world now, they'll say, you know what, this doctor, this functional medicine doctor did this test and it shows I don't have Lyme disease, I don't have heavy metals, I don't have molds, or whatever it is. And I said, yeah, well, we're going to treat it anyway, because if we're going to treat 99% of your potential causes, you're going to get better. And I want to make sure that when people come into my world, mine is the last program that they need in order to be able to get better. And the reality is that, with a lot of people spending thousands of dollars on laboratory tests, it's not going to cost them any more money or take any longer. In fact, it's going to shorten the time period because instead of, not finding out that you have heavy metals until month 9, and then it's going to take you 6 to 12 months to get the heavy metals out of your body, we've just saved you a ton of time, energy, and money, and we're going to get you to the finish line faster. So, it's an about face for somebody like me, trained in as an MD, really relied a lot on testing. It's just kind of like what I've seen and I'm always thinking about how can I get people better faster, right? And so this was one of those pivots that I made that has really served people very well.
I I so respect that very, very much because I do think with how available labs are and functional medicine becoming more well known, there are a lot of lab tests that are thousands and thousands of dollars. And I have wondered what you answered many times of there are many things that get tested in urine. And I've wondered, well, isn't that level really dependent on how well our liver is detoxing or how well our body is actually detoxing? And so, what if we got a marker that said that a level in our urine is really low and it's actually accumulated in our body and we're not detoxing it properly? And I've wondered that, and it's been a question that many practitioners have not answered. And there have been also many situations of spending thousands of dollars on lab tests and then saying, well, wouldn't we have treated this regardless of whether we knew what strain it was or whether it was there or not? Would we have maybe taken the same approach whether we had this data or not? So I can definitely respect that you want to be as minimalist as possible with running extra labs and wasting extra time and just saying, let's treat it.
Yeah, and we use, we use additional tinctures in order to be able to make sure that we're addressing everything, but they're herbal and they're all complementary and they're all working on a number of different things at a time. And like I said, over the long period, it definitely doesn't cost you any more, and in fact, it costs you less. So it's been really helpful for this process in getting people better faster. And it just so happens that the toxic five are also causes of cancer and Alzheimer's and autoimmune disease, right? And so it just makes sense to clear all this crap out of your body.
Wow. And so would that be the same for people who come in to see you who don't have a strong presentation of infection or long COVID, but maybe they do have an overwhelming, stressful life, or they have had a stressful life and they're on the edge of adrenal burnout or adrenal exhaustion? Are those treated? Do you approach those the same, or can you compare some of those differences?
Yeah, so whenever we're looking at stress, there's the mental and the emotional stress, whether it's from historical trauma or whether it's current trauma or stress, relationships, work, etc. And then there's the physical stressors. So the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections, those are all physical stressors. And so that's always a really great question. The people who I see, they oftentimes have already done a nervous system retraining program or they've seen counselors and they've been working on their mindset, and that it's more than just having a stressful job. That's definitely part of it. Like as humans, we're really not built for the way that society is structured today. All the stressors, all the requirements that we have, the news, like all of these different insults that we're experiencing on a regular basis. You have to have a really good mindfulness and mindset practice in order to be able to withstand these insults every day. And so I know you talk a lot about that. We talk a lot about it. We have a nervous system retraining component of our program, which we introduced about 6 months ago because I saw the writing on the wall and I saw that people get better when they're doing the nervous system retraining. It
Wow.
really accelerates their ability to get better faster. So I tell people, we don't know if retraining your nervous system is 90% of your issue or 10%. There's always the toxic five, there's always all of them, but the question is always how much of them do you have?
Mm.
The other thing too is that you may not appear like you have Lyme disease or Babesia or Bartonella or some of these Lyme type co-infections or Epstein-Barr or COVID. But when we start removing, they're all really bound up together, what I call this toxic matrix. So when we start removing the heavy metals and the chemicals and the molds, the infections get released and vice versa. And so we want to make sure because you've got, we have all these toxins from mom through the placenta. There's studies to show that over 300 different chemicals are found in baby's cord blood, and that study was done about a decade ago. And so we come out of the womb already with a bunch of these toxins, and then we get these insults, these pesticides and these herbicides and insecticides and the metals and the mercury fillings, etc. And we get this total body burden that builds up, right? So nobody leaves this life unscathed without all these toxins, right?
Mm.
And so, there's always going to be this complement. And yes, we have to, the people, yeah, I say that, if you can get better just by working on your stress and managing your stress, amazing. That's great. People don't have to come to see me. And then if you can replace your deficiencies, and just optimize those, optimize your lifestyle habits, and you can get back to ideal, awesome. You don't have to come see me. I'm for those people who've kind of done those things, and then they need to go this next step where they need to go deeper into the nervous system retraining, and they need to get rid of these toxins and infections.
That's wonderful that you have the nervous system retraining as part of your program. And so, for anyone who doesn't understand the connection between the nervous system and how that might influence chronic fatigue or healing and energy, can you make that bridge there for how those influence each other?
Absolutely. So the nervous system dysfunction is part of the toxic five. And so
Mm.
you can have nervous system dysfunction, which is basically your nervous system has been damaged by any one of the other toxic four. So the toxins and infections will all damage your nervous system. And then you can also have it from trauma. And this can be big T trauma, like abuse, or it can be from little t trauma, like growing up in a household with imperfect parents and imperfect siblings and imperfect peers, right? Where you're just trying to get your needs met. I had a very happy childhood and I still had trauma, and so I got rejected by peer groups. I had challenges with my siblings. My parents were trying to get their needs met, and so I'm trying to please my parents. And so this ends up happening and then it no longer serves you. We're really built for connection and attachment and making sure that we can survive as children. And so there are certain ways that we act that serve us when we're younger. And then as we get older, they no longer serve us, right? And in fact, they are then stressful for us. And so that's really where we have to try to retrain our thoughts and our beliefs. And consequently, then that takes place and changes our actions and the decisions that we make. And so there is, so the coming back to your original question, so the nervous system dysfunction is going to have a very significant effect on the immune system and also on the mitochondria and its ability to produce energy since it makes 70 to 90% of the energy. So it's all part of this total body burden that is just really heavy on the body that needs to be removed.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you can see the whole greater perspective that I think a lot of doctors don't look at, which is it's not just about healing the virus. It's not just about the nutrients or the mitochondria. It's not just about this one thing in isolation, but that our beliefs and our past childhood experiences and all of these things are a part of healing and they all work together and nothing is separate. And it's not this diagnosis versus this one, but maybe how do all these parts of us all work together. And I'd be curious if you would think about it in this way. I heard this analogy of how the nervous system influences our energy and our adrenals as being like when we're younger, having these different experiences, whether it's trauma or a lot of stress, is kind of like the sports car where you're just like pedal to the metal, you're like releasing cortisol, your nervous system is like in this release that feels like a lot of adrenaline. But if that pedal is always pushed down, eventually you start to peter out and it starts to turn into the minivan. And then it can turn into the old clunker when your body has just been constantly like releasing and releasing adrenaline and cortisol. And that's how our own thoughts are connected to our energy and this ability to feel like we have energy. Would you say that that is accurate for a car analogy?
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. I would say I wonder if I can come up with a better analogy, but I would say, in terms of our beliefs, if we believe that we're not enough, if we believe that we're not safe, if we are constantly pushing, hustling for our worthiness, right? We do well in school, we get a good job, we do well in sports, like whatever it is, in order to make our parents proud, our grandparents, whatever it is, as we're pushing, we're pushing this boulder up the hill and eventually we run out of steam, right?
Mhm.
And so consequently it becomes too much, at least from a psychological standpoint. And sometimes we can recover, like if we quit a job or if we rest for a week or take a vacation or something like that, oftentimes that can make a difference. But if when we have the other toxins and infections, that's really where it becomes near impossible to recover fully.
Yeah, I can relate to so much of what you're saying, where I being through my own health journey, and a big part of that being looking at my beliefs and the way I was perceiving, am I productive enough? Am I doing enough? And the difference between having a productive day out of fear of I won't be secure, I won't be good enough, I won't be valuable enough, versus I'm just busy and I'm getting things done, is a completely different experience in my nervous system. And do I end my day in depletion, or do I end my day feeling good? So that was such a really big part of me. And I think that that alone was the biggest domino in my food cravings and my relationship with food, and that connection between feeling exhausted, depleted, and not even feeling like I had control over my food choices, to having such a different relationship with food. I don't know if you could kind of speak to that connection.
Yeah, can you love yourself even when times are hard, right?
Mm.
It's about, dancing in the rain or being the calm in the middle of the chaos, right? I struggle with that as well, having an urgency that things have to get done right now, so I have to breathe, I have to do my mindset work, I have to remember, I have to practice my gratitudes and examine what are the thoughts that I'm currently having that are putting me in a suffering state, right? And so it's like, okay, and then what is the opposite of that thought? It's like, okay, there is nothing urgent. Everything's going to happen in the way that it needs to be. Ah, I can take a deep breath and I can relax and I can move through my day at a different pace. But it takes that mindfulness. I'm glad we're on this mindfulness podcast, right? It takes that mindfulness to be able to, that awareness of identifying what's happening in the moment and not being stuck in our brains and our thoughts, right? And being like, what are we feeling in our bodies? And then going into our thoughts and being like, okay, what am I thinking really that's not serving me right now?
Mm. And how could those thoughts be applied, or would you suggest something different for some people who are on this path to like healing these infections or long COVID, and it's a very uncomfortable place to be in inside of their bodies? I know some of my students who are recovering from Lyme and viruses and things that are extremely painful, extremely uncomfortable. I know chronic fatigue is probably incredibly uncomfortable. How can we work with our minds or with our bodies so that it can feel safe to be in our bodies? Or how do we navigate the discomfort that comes with that?
Yeah, great question. So, in our nervous system retraining practice, we're talking about the mindset components. So, starting off with gratitude, even if you are uncomfortable, you don't feel well, you have the fatigue, you can have gratitude for something. And so much of this is retraining the nervous system. There are people who get better from chronic fatigue syndrome just by retraining their nervous system, right? So, that's why I say that it could be 90% of your issue. So it's really important, regardless of whatever conditions or symptoms that you have, it's so important to start with, that feeling of safety. And so it comes from feeling gratitudes. And there's research on all these things I'm going to talk about. And so feeling gratitude, and if you can't name certain things, and it can be the same things every day, but you really want to, you want more than thinking it, you want to feel it. You want to feel that gratitude. And it can be if you're lying in bed, you're grateful for the sheets. You're grateful you have a roof over your head. You're grateful for your partner or your family or your pets, right? What can you be grateful for? And then the next step is to look at what limiting beliefs you're thinking. I'm never going to get better, or why do I feel like this, right? Those really aren't serving you, right? And so what's the opposite? I know I'm going to get better. I just have to take another step,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Then you also have to have a vision for your life. The body doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality. This is why people love that thrill of watching horror movies. Not everybody.
Mhm.
I do not. It's not good for
Mhm.
my nervous
Yes.
system. But a lot of people, my daughter, loves it. And it's like this adrenaline sort of thing that you experience. There's studies that have been done to show that your body doesn't really know the difference. And so you need to imagine what your life looks like when you have everything that you want.
Mm.
Your ideal health, what does that look like? Your ideal relationship, your ideal work. What do all those things look like? And so we recommend that people walk through a process of, going through their day. You wake up in the morning, who are you next to? What does your house look like? This is the way that you create that resonance so that you can achieve what you want and you can improve your health. And it feels good. It feels good to be in that space. And the more that you can be in that space, the more your nervous system can realize and your body can realize, oh, this is resonance. This is actually what I'm working towards. And then things align for you to continue to move forward. And then the last of that four-step process is asking yourself empowering questions. So why do I feel like crap really isn't going to serve you because you're going to get, the brain is a goal-achieving machine. It's like your AI, answering your questions. And it's going to give you answers that you're not going to like. But asking yourself a question like, how can I love myself more today? How can I love my wife and my child more today? How can I support my employees more today? Like those are all questions that I'm asking myself on the daily. And then I get good answers. Okay, I can really support myself by taking more breaks, by, I've got a standing station and half my day standing and half my day sitting, for going for a walk with my wife. Like, how can I have more connection? Right. And so that's the mindset component. And so that's considered like top down, like brain to body. And then there's the bottom up. And so this is what can you do with your body that can change your nervous system, do some polyvagal retrainings, doing some humming, some singing, some gargling, some meditation, a body scan that I do every morning before I get out of bed. All of those things can kind of go into this bottom up approach. So we're retraining the nervous system in different ways, and then you kind of latch onto, I recommend doing all of it, but there are certain things that you're going to latch onto that feel really good. So for me, when I kind of get stuck, I have an affirmation of I'm safe, I'm loved, I'm enough.
Mm.
And it's more than just saying it. I have to sit there and I have to kind of feel it and I have to remind myself. And sometimes you have to give yourself the data. Like I've always been safe. Even when things are hard, I've always been really safe. And I've always been loved, whether it's by parents or a universal love, right?
Mhm.
God's love, whatever you want to say. And I've always been enough,
Mm.
right? I am enough just by being born. I am enough. I don't have to do anything in order to be able to be enough. So oftentimes I have to remind myself as I am retraining my nervous system.
Yeah, and probably feeling that, like you mentioned, not just thinking it and saying it and repeating it back, it's an affirmation, but allowing the time for your body and your nervous system to like fully receive it and make a meaningful shift from feeling that and receiving that.
Yeah.
I am so grateful that we are talking about your program because I am so aligned with the way that you teach, the knowledge that you have. It is so rare to have the combination of the nervous system regulation, the really deep belief work, the emotional work, the science piece behind it. It's so much of my core philosophy when focusing on more of the relationship with food and health. And so I appreciate that from an energy perspective and this type of healing, I feel so much alignment with everything that you're saying and sharing. And I know that as people are listening, if you've been listening for a while or if you're one of my students, you'd be like, wait, we do that stuff. Wait, we do that stuff. Yeah, we're all about that too. Um, so I can really appreciate all these components of your program and how well-rounded it is. So as people are exploring this for themselves and they're feeling and they're getting curious about like their energy or their next best step to take, are there specific symptoms that they should look out for to know should they take a next step on exploring? Is this long COVID or chronic fatigue? Or what are the key things that they should look out for to know how to take a next step?
Yeah. So if you have a fatigue that's not relieved by rest, where you're waking up in the morning and your energy is not what it used to be or not what you want it to be, and you find that you're napping or you're crashing and you're relying more on caffeine and you're not able to do fun things in the evenings or on the weekends or you can't travel because you're not sure when your energy is going to crash again, your body is screaming at you to do something about it. And so it's really when your low energy gets in the way of your life. That's really when it's time to pay attention. Because it could be just as something easy as going gluten-free or cutting sugar out of your diet or eating more regularly or drinking more water or getting more sleep, right? It's just optimizing your lifestyle habits, which you can very easily figure out what are optimal lifestyle habits and just do those things, right? It doesn't cost you anything.
That's a really great point, which we didn't really talk about. Are there some checks that people should look for of like what are some lifestyle things that I should be checking these boxes for sure as my base foundation?
Yeah, are you getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night? That's a big one. And
Hmm.
going to bed earlier, potentially 10 o'clock,
Hmm.
9 o'clock, whatever your body is telling you is time to go to bed. Once you started yawning, you've kind of missed your window, and your window is probably about like a half an hour before that. So just pay attention to when you start yawning and then start going to bed before that. But your time after dinner should all be geared towards getting ready for bed. So no horror films, no intense. I mean, for some people, you can exercise and that like works for them and they can sleep well. But for other people, no intense physical activity, no intense conversations, not a lot of thinking. Like you want to be more in a relaxed state. Some people are reading, some people are watching TV. Like you want to do things that cater towards falling asleep. And then you want to have a really nice dark environment and a cool environment for when you're going to go to bed. So that's the first one is sleep. The second one's going to be water. Consuming at least 2 liters of water a day. Ideally, it's going to be filtered water. For the people who are going through my program and removing toxins, they really need 3 liters of water a day. Oftentimes I remember, when I started getting more holistic, as I started to go into residency, I survived on caffeine when I was in medical school and being on call. And then when I was in residency, I knew enough to know that caffeine was slamming my adrenals and it wasn't good for me. And so I was going to see whether or not consuming enough water and staying hydrated was going to be the fix. And sure enough, it was. And so I challenge people, go ahead and try to replace your caffeinated beverages with drinking more water. And oftentimes it can make a really big difference. Put a little bit of sea salt in your water to taste, and that can really help your adrenals as well. So it's usually not perfect depending on how much caffeine you're drinking, but it can definitely be incredibly supportive. So that's water. And then in terms of food, I try to be flexible on food. It's more about what you're not eating, what you shouldn't eat, than what you are eating. And so I tell people that, ideally you're not consuming gluten, you're not consuming dairy, you're not consuming sugars, you're not consuming processed foods. But the rest you can consume in as much as you want. So you probably have a different philosophy, but that's kind of like
Yeah,
that's what
I would
it seems.
agree.
Okay, because people when
Yeah.
they come to see me, they've tried so many different diets and they're tired of the restrictive eating. And in
Yeah.
general, like doing a food elimination diet can be helpful. But when you have all the toxic fiber that you're going to be working on, I try to give people some grace and be like, you can do the best you can with, this sort of structure over here. And people seem to appreciate that.
Yep. Yeah.
And so that's food, that's water, that's sleep, and then exercise. I tell people, getting your Goldilocks dose of movement. So most of the people that I work with can't really move that much, or they get the post-exertional malaise where they exert themselves and they feel worse. And so I tell people, I want you to move as much as you can without feeling worse. And
Mm.
that's without feeling worse that day after you exercise or even the next day. Because sometimes people will be like, well, I felt fine afterwards, but then the next day I crashed when I walk a mile. You're
Mm.
like, all right, well, don't walk a mile. Walk a half a mile. Maybe you can do 5 minutes of exercise without crashing. Maybe it's jumping jacks. Maybe it's dancing to your favorite song, right? So then you get the joy and then you also get the movement in together, right? Especially if it's your favorite song from high school, right? Going
I
back.
think I saw in your bio something about hip hop dancing.
That's true. Yep. Yeah,
I love it.
we'll move the island, and my daughter loves to hip hop dance, and I do
Love
as well.
it.
I mean, we're not trained, but we love to put on some techno music or some K-pop and just kind of dance it out. And it just
Yep.
feels so good to kind of like move our bodies. And that wasn't something that I could do when I had my chronic fatigue, like performing. Like I'm a singer, and I like to sing musicals, and now I can get on stage and perform. Previously, I wasn't able to do that because of my nervous system dysfunction and my any sort of stress response that I would have, I would just shut down and I would crash. And so
Mm,
that's an aside. But those are kind of like the lifestyle habits that I would encourage people to work on. And if you can get better with that, wonderful.
yeah.
Then you're good to go. If not, then you might have to start looking at some of the deficiencies you have. And if you can't get better with that, then it's time to look at removing the toxic five.
Perfect. That breaks it down and makes it so easy to understand, clarifies so much for me there. And you also have a free masterclass. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So this is my four-step process to resolving chronic fatigue and long COVID. Whether you have chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic fatigue, this is going to be appropriate. It goes more into my philosophy of care. And so it's just a wonderful opportunity for people to hopefully learn something more about their condition and what they need to do in order to get better.
Great. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to point people to? I'll make sure that your links are all here in the show notes. Is there anywhere else you want people to check out or follow you?
Well, I think if they go to Energy MD Method, that's my website, and they can click on the link to watch the masterclass. That's really the best place to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your expertise here. I have learned so much from you in this conversation. I feel a lot more empowered with what my body is telling me and what I need to be aware of and what those shifts in energy could really be telling me. So I feel so much more empowered my body with everything that you shared. And I so appreciate your philosophy and I feel your deep care for people, not just on a testing supplement kind of level, but truly looking at them as a whole person and really helping them. And so I can imagine that is what created such a powerful program for you. I saw your website and it's full of life-changing testimonials and it's very impressive. I appreciate you sharing all your expertise.
Thank you, Gina. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you guys. Feel free to leave any comments that you have, any insights or awarenesses or ahas, and check out Dr. Evans' masterclass. And we'll see you next time.